Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today we're going to be talking about rule sets. So as the thumbnail says, the question that I had going into this most recent tournament I went to down in Philly called Revolution Rumble was, does a rule set influence my fighting style? And to quickly answer the question, it is both yes and no, but in very different ways than I really expected. Going into the tournament, if you had asked me whether or not I thought anybody, including myself, changed their fighting style to fit a rule set, I would have said no. And I would have said no because my long amount of time spent watching my own footage and other people's footage has revealed to me that a lot of what even very respected and very well knowledgeable fighters think about rule sets often does not show itself in the data or in the evidence. What I have found is that when you review either your own footage or other people's footage, is that 9 times out of 10, they go back to what they know and what they have trained to do over and over and over again. When the pressure is on and the fight is close and they can't simply do whatever they want, whenever they want, they will go back to what they know. And what they know is what they have trained, and what they have trained is generally under the pretext of a particular set of rules, or at least a particular set of priorities. So to really briefly go over it, this tournament, Revolution Rumble, had the dreaded, more maligned right-of-way rule set. And going into this, again, I would have said that this would not have influenced my fencing whatsoever. And just like I said earlier, it did and it didn't. Going into this initial fight, which I'm showing here with Connor, Connor beat me pretty soundly by utilizing a lot of what I would say are his pretty typical stylistic indicators. He is a body practitioner. He loves entering range with good hand shots. He loves to take steps forward. And basically, he will force you into a condition where you start an exchange so that he can use his mezzo tempos and his half tempos to basically interrupt you, kind of like you just saw there in that exchange. He's very good at defeating a mid-round Zverki Hev style like I have. And he has extremely good precision with his thrusts so that he can take care of that. And as we could say, there's nothing he did differently in this fight than he would have done in any other fight. But what you could maybe say is that if we go back and watch one of these exchanges, that there are certain instances where the right-of-way rule set changed the outcome to be more or less, indicative or rewarding to Connor's style.
JW.
With that particular exchange, if we watch this, I do a faint little left overhow. I hit my opponent on the arms. I normally would consider this an extraordinarily bad position to be in. My opponent attempts to, counteract me or punish me for my bad positioning, and I just barely managed to get my sword in the way. But if we want to imagine that this was not a right-of-way rule set, and at this particular point when my opponent is going to hit me in the head, that he did successfully hit me in the head, what would you try to rule this exchange as under different rule sets? Well, under a Nordic rule set, Connor would have gotten 2 points for striking me in the head, and I would have gotten 1 for striking him in the arm, meaning that despite the fact that I hit first, Connor would have gotten more points for hitting a higher priority target. In many other rule sets, this is generally the norm. Sometimes the afterblows are deductive, as is a very common thing, meaning that despite the fact that I hit Connor first in the arm, him hitting me in the head wouldn't net him 1 point for hitting a higher priority target, but it would cancel out my attack, essentially saying that by hitting me in a higher priority target, despite getting hit second and failing to protect himself in the arm, we basically wash the exchange out to neutral. But in this particular rule set, again, with the rules of right-of-way, because when I was stepping forward with my attack here, as you see me come forward and feint and throw my left overhow, because I struck here, everything that Connor does after this point is completely nullified. He did not successfully parry my attack, which means he did not successfully take the right-of-way back, which means that my attack is 100% valid no matter what happens, and even if he chopped my head off and brought it back home to my family, I'd still get my point. And there's a lot of discussion that people have as to whether or not this is more or less martially valid, or more or less realistic, or more or less blah, blah, blah. And my response to these kinds of discussions is basically that I don't care. I really don't care whether or not a rule set emphasizes one particular kind of fencing, because no matter what happens, every rule set emphasizes the exact same kind of fencing, namely hit and don't get hit. All right-of-way does, especially if you go back and you look at an exchange like this one, is resolve a double. Now, you could say in this particular exchange, Connor and I just both stab each other. And under many rule sets, Nordic, deductive afterblows, whatever long point, this would just be a double. But in this particular case, with a right-of-way rule set, what we have to determine is who is stepping into the action first. And this is where Connor's style is giving him a lot of benefit, particularly because his style teaches him to always enter the threatening space of an engagement with a movement. Whereas I, a very defensive fighter and someone who is a big fan of Olympic-style shield-hal thrusts straight from cold open, is at a disadvantage here. Not just a disadvantage in the sense that it's something that wouldn't necessarily get me a point in this rule set because I didn't move first, but also it's a disadvantage in really any kind of fight under any sort of context, because if all you do is attack with full commitment and full intent, well, chances are you're going to be hit in the middle of your preparation. And if you're always getting hit in your preparation, you're not doing a clean form of fencing where you hit your opponent and don't get hit back. So the idea that a lot of people have is that right-of-way fencing encourages offense way too much, and it doesn't favor defense. And besides the fact that those people clearly don't understand the rules very well, because parries actually give the defender an extreme advantage to the point where under some interpretations, any contact with the blade that I make going in actually counts as a parry for my opponent and a loss of right-of-way from me. But again, that was not necessarily how this particular tournament was run. But the reason I bring this up is that throughout this fight with Connor, I was losing pretty poorly. Again, Connor was doing a very good job of entering his engagements with intent. He was threatening my hands, forcing me to go backwards, and being very wary of those hand snipes. And anytime I tried to capitalize on a missed hand cut, it was essentially a bait. Connor would wait for me to basically overextend myself with his Verkow or an Oberhau here. He would parry it and then use a mezzo-tempo to punish me in the hands or the head as I tried to return to a more neutral place and throw an attack of my own. He was doing a very good job of out-fencing me, as that exchange shows, in hitting me and not getting hit. No part of right-of-way really had anything to do with this. But if you're wondering why I'm talking at length about this, it's because there's still the other half of what I said at the beginning here. This rule set did influence my fencing, just not in the way that people expect. So the question now is, what conclusion do we draw from this? Obviously, I have a different opinion now than how I went into the tournament, but not for the reasons that I think most people would expect. I went into my first right-of-way tournament thinking that the tournament was going to change my fencing style, in particular because I thought that it was going to de-emphasize the way that I like to fight, and that as a result, if I wanted to do well, I had to change what I was going to do in order to benefit. The problem is that the opposite ended up happening. Instead of this rule set de-emphasizing some of my best fencing, what it instead did was emphasize some of my best fencing. And the problem that I had was, because I went into this tournament with my own bias against the rule set, I basically unintentionally fought worse, assuming that I would get a benefit, only to find that, as I said at the beginning of this, there was no physical way for me to change how I fence. And that when the pressure was on and when we were in the elimination bracket against somebody, Sam Rouse here on the right, who I fenced a bunch of times before and know that he's a very good fencer and someone who can most certainly beat me, I would even say 55% of the time, I was unable to fence differently than I normally would. And I found that regardless of whatever rule set I was under, at the end of the day, whether or not I was aggressive or defensive, I was using all of the things that I had learned, and I wasn't using anything else. There was no way for me to avoid the skills and the techniques that I favor, and regardless of whether or not I was winning exchanges or losing exchanges, the only reason I fenced worse at the beginning of this tournament and better at the end was because I was no longer in my own head about what I was doing and whether or not it would be considered valid or good by the rule set. So if there's anything to take away from this, if you think that a right-of-way rule set will ruin HEMA, you're objectively wrong. But more importantly, if you think that a right-of-way rule set will ruin you, you might actually find that fencing under some very bizarre or right-of-way based rule sets that you might find that it actually brings out a better fencer than you expected, because it forces you to basically do things that you didn't realize you were good at, and do things that you have been trained to do your entire career but never did because you were always fencing to a different rule set. You were fencing to a different standard. So my advice to people is watch your own tournament footage, watch your own rule sets, and see for yourself whether or not you really change. Because my suspicion is that you don't change nearly as much as you think you do, and that when you watch these tournaments, especially, again, something like this with a right-of-way format, right-of-way comes into play far less than you would expect it to. And at the end of the day, good fencing is good fencing, and whether or not you are on a good day or on an off day, that has nothing to do with the rule set. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send me an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.